Today we're here with Wendell Albright, the developer for Nevsky from GMT Games, which is currently on the P500. In fact, it made its P500 goal about three or so weeks afterwards. So Wendell, we appreciate your time. What is this game, just in general? Give us an idea of what the game is.
The game is about the famous war in the 1240s between the Teutonic Knights, who were a military order, and Novgorod, which was a commercial power in Russia that at the time the Teutonic Knights thought would be sufficiently distracted by the Mongols who were out here somewhere that maybe they'd be easy pickings. And so there was a war fought over the course of a couple of years, which featured a lot of raiding by both sides, sieging, storming castles, and a few big battles, including the famous battle on the ice, where Alexander Nevsky defeated the Teutonic Knights, and 700 years later became the feature in a big Soviet movie for having won that victory. But in this game, you aren't just moving your guys around on the map and maneuvering, trying to get an advantage on the other guy, conquering and ravaging places. You're also having to manage the whole sort of force structure of your side by bringing in lords who are represented by maps to show what they're worth, by bringing them in. The trouble is, unlike 20th century modern militaries, these guys were independent operators who maybe owed an obligation to a more senior lord. So they would agree, okay, you've summoned us, we're coming for 120 days. And after 120 days, which would be 3 turns in Nevsky, that guy would check out. Unless you can do something rewarding him with money or rewarding that lord with loot that you've taken from the enemy. If you can't do that, the guy is going to check out. So a big part of the game is bringing in more forces on your side, keeping lords on the map, having those lords promote their own vassals to supplement your forces, and making sure you've got the right transport available to bring in the supply you need, so that when you go off into enemy territory, that you can feed the guys. Because if you don't feed your armies, they become unhappy. Right. And that's a good way...
They fight on their stomachs, right?
Exactly. That's a good way for your service to become reduced and to make that lord and his forces leave even more quickly. Another good way to have your service reduced, which I don't recommend, is to fight and lose a battle. Because that also tends to make lords and their subordinates unhappy, and it's another way to do it. So you really, up here on the calendar, you're trying to manipulate your forces to keep them in the field. Down here on the map, you're actually moving guys around, you're drawing supplies, you're going into enemy territory where you might be ravaging it to capture loot and to gain victory points, and going after enemy fortified spots, which are forts and cities basically, to capture them, which is the main way that you're earning victory points. So it's a real battle of a lot of maneuver, a lot of raiding, some field battles, but as was historically the case, you try to avoid going to a field battle unless you're pretty sure you're going to win. If the other guy feels like you're going to win, he's probably going to avoid the battle as well.
Right.
So unless you have a special event card up your sleeve, an ambush maybe, you can't necessarily be guaranteed of forcing the other guy to come into combat. And so a big part of it is also that, maneuvering your forces, presenting a threat. Maybe if you present a big enough threat, the other guy will risk a battle out of desperation to try to force you out of there.
So tell us about the event cards and the capabilities. I thought that was a pretty interesting part of the design.
Both the Russians and the Teutonics, this is the Teutonic deck, have a deck of cards where the top half of it is an event. This event, for example, makes some of the Russian lords shorten their service. They're going to leave sooner. That's bad for the Russians. An event like this is one you can hold, which will give the Teutonic Knights an advantage in the battle. And so every turn you draw a couple of these events. But the event cards are also on the same card as what are called capabilities, which are things like this. Crossbowmen will give a Teutonic lord, whoever you assign it to, and like if you give it to Heinrich here, and additional ability for his men-at-arms to get an archery shot as well as a melee shot. When you play that, though, you've taken this ambush card out of the deck. And so you have a trade-off between these events at the top, which are really nice, and whether or not you keep the capability or not. There are also some no events. You can always draw, something that's unfortunate. The Warrior Monks, for example, helps a couple of the Teutonic lords become even stronger in battle by giving their knights an extra ability to absorb damage before they rout or are defeated in combat. Stonemasons is an interesting one. Historically, the Teutonic knights managed to capture a Russian area and then build a castle pretty quickly. And this card, for example, gives you that ability to do that and to make a place worth a victory point that maybe it wasn't worth before. So that's an interesting capability. It takes a lot of supplies to do it because you got to, when you're building a castle, you got to plan. You can't just go staggering off and do it.
That was my impression of just our discussion. Is planning is a big part.
Absolutely.
How do you get your sources of supply? How do you transport those sources of supply?
Yeah, your provender, your food to feed them in. Because every time you move on the map or fight on the map, your guys expect to be fed.
Right.
If they don't get fed, they start to become shorter and shorter in service, and you can eventually see them wither away and possibly be gone for a while or potentially gone for good out of the game entirely. The other interesting thing, there's a second deck of cards for both sides, which just have the coat of arms for the nobles in question, 3 each. And this is a planning deck. And for people who know Angola, this is similar to that. For all of your lords that you have on the map, and you won't necessarily have all of them on the map at one time, at the beginning of the season, you will make up a queue, a plan of 4, 5, or 6 cards, depending on the time of year. So let's say we've got these 4 guys, and I might, if it's a winter turn, I might have this queue. The first Teutonic lord to move is going to be Andreas. He does his thing. Russians they flip their card, do their thing. Newt and Abel, who are a couple of Danish princes who are fighting here, would have their turn. The Russian guy would move. Herman does his thing, Russian guy, and then Herman again. You have 3 cards, so I could have done 1, 2, 3 Herman if I'd wanted to, and done a lot with him.
And these cards, these are action points.
That shows, higher is better. So it shows their relative ability to do things once they're in the field. 3 is the best you have. 2 is, so it's pretty typical. But most actions cost 1 command point in effect to do something. If you're moving an army that's burdened, that you have a lot of loot and a lot of food, more than what your transport is, it's going to slow you down to move. On the other hand, you want that provender, because if you're going away from your supply sources into enemy territory where you can't get it easily, you really want to make sure you've got it so you don't see your guys starving and losing their ability to stay in the field.
So what is the response of playtesters been?
It's been really positive. I taught a guy last night, another fellow World in Flames player, for the first time, and at the end of the game he was raving about it. He loved the different the logistical element of it. It's an important part of it. He liked how battle was rare, but the way the battle works, where your individual forces had the capacity to absorb hits without routing, the better forces doing that more effectively, of
course.
Knights. Knights are the most effective. They have a pretty good chance of absorbing a hit but remaining in good order. Militia, much less so. And if you have serfs, which the Russians can have, they have no chance. If anything happens to them, they melt away. So the whole combat system and the siege system, where if it's a big fortified position or if it's a position defended by an enemy lord, it's going to take you some time to build up your siege walls, to establish a perimeter around it, and probably to starve the other guy out. Because if there's an enemy lord with any sort of force with him behind the walls of the castle, storming that castle to get rid of him is very difficult, because the walls are an additional layer of protection for the lord, in addition to the usual ability of pieces to absorb damage without routing, without it going away.
So in essence, we have an East Front game,
700 years earlier.
700 years before what we know in World War II.
Exactly.
Definitely seems very interesting. I'm very intrigued by the supply part of the game. The siege element looks very, very interesting. And the movement part as well. And then the levy, trying to manage this economy. It just looks very interesting.
It is. There's a lot of moving parts, and like any good game, it gives you a lot of decisions to make about what to do with your commands, what to do with your, and the political side of things with mustering forces, how to handle that, and then at the end, how to maneuver your guys into a way to get the most advantage for your side, and to try to win this, to get the most victory points to win this particular little conflict. Little, it was not that little, but the numbers are actually quite small compared to an East Front game.
Yeah, right. Well, Wendell, we appreciate your time today.
Oh, my pleasure.
Thanks for showing us the game. And once again, this is Nevsky, which is currently on the P500 for GMT Games. My guess is it's a 2019
That's, I think, is the
game.
hope, yeah. I think GMT's website says spring of 19.
Okay. Well,
Yeah.
great. So thanks for sharing with us
my
today.
pleasure.
We appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure.
All right. Yeah, thank you.